President Trump recently made a bizarre post on X. He quoted Napoleon saying, "He who saves his country does not violate any law." It's an alleged Napoleon Bonaparte quote. And a lot of people took this and said, whoa, this is just straight up like fascism, authoritarianism. What on earth is he talking about? He's saying that, if I save my country, which he's going to say he saved the country, even if he doesn't, then he can just say, well, I did nothing wrong no matter what. I get to break the law because when I break the law, then it's not actually breaking the law, and it's all good. So regardless of what he meant by that, he's still a concerning figure. I could see him meaning that in some other way than the people who are applying the worst possible interpretation. But at the same time, it's like, you can't help but think that he's compensating for the fact that he's a felon, a convicted felon, and the first convicted felon president too. And maybe he feels insecure about that. So he's saying, well, you know what? I am this man with this grand vision, and I'm going to save the country with my policies and my amazing decision making. So I don't violate any laws by my very nature because I'm so good. That is very authoritarian, although we don't know that he meant it that way necessarily. It's bad enough that we're having this conversation, though, about the president of the United States. Like, is he just saying that, he never violates any laws? Because Trump is the king of ambiguity, making ambiguous statements that sound really authoritarian and possibly fascistic, but also having some sort of other interpretation for them available. But now we have to have the conversation. Is Trump the most authoritarian president in U.S. history? There are a lot of people concerned about this. And I know we have a lot of recency bias where we really focus on the flaws of recent U.S. presidents and maybe sugarcoat some of the older U.S. presidents, the people from the 1900s, the people from the 1800s, and our founding fathers. Everyone loves our founding fathers, even though they owned slaves. But people are willing to overlook a lot of their flaws, and they focus on our current leaders and say, oh, our current leaders are so bad. Trump's so bad, Biden's so bad, Obama's so bad, Bush is so bad. Everyone loves to beat up on the contemporary presidents. But we have to put things in a little more context here. So let's talk about both policy and rhetoric. I am going to come to the conclusion by the end of this video that Trump, if you take into account both policy and rhetoric, is the most authoritarian president in U.S. history. If you take only policy into account, then it's more of a wash. So we have a lot of history of authoritarian policies in the United States. Not just from presidents who are considered good, by the way, or bad, I should say, but presidents who are good have pursued authoritarian policies. So let's consider FDR and his Japanese internment camps. That's kind of an issue. That's kind of a problem. Putting people into internment camps based on their race, just saying, well, we're at war with Japan, so we get to do what we want with you. Fortunately, they were not death camps, but still internment camps. And the Supreme Court, which was a bunch of FDR appointees like Hugo Black and William O. Douglas, they sided with FDR. They sided with the Japanese internment camps. And it was actually not until Reagan that the Japanese who were interned got some reparations, actually. So there's that big mark against FDR. He's known as one of the best presidents in history, and yet he did one of the most authoritarian decisions, which was Japanese internment. We have to also talk about another Democrat actually named Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is kind of similar to Trump in that, he's made some racially questionable statements, to say the least. He's considered a racist. He was a segregationist. He showed Birth of a Nation at the White House. But what's really authoritarian about his policies was the way that he controlled the country during World War I, the iron grip that he had on the United States and the media, and he silenced dissent. He really just did not want to hear what people had to say against World War I. He did an aggressive crackdown on free speech. Eugene V. Debs, who was an opponent of the draft, got jailed. Woodrow Wilson, of course, a huge supporter of the draft. Not a good look at all. And a lot of conservatives would say he's authoritarian for signing the income tax into law. But I don't know if that's necessarily authoritarian. even if are some good arguments against the nature of the income tax as it exists today. But yeah, Woodrow Wilson was a big government guy, and he was a guy who did not like dissent. Andrew Jackson, likewise. I mean, the Trail of Tears, some of that stuff, it was just really heavy-handed, and I think it's fair to call it authoritarianism. Lyndon B. Johnson and the Vietnam War, even, I think he could be put up there. He was really convinced that he was doing things the right way with the Vietnam War. And yeah, we don't have a war like Lyndon B. Johnson had under Trump necessarily. But yeah, he was an aggressive, he also signed the Civil Rights Act, so he has some bright spots. But on foreign policy, he was aggressive and authoritarian. George W. Bush, again, the Iraq War, torture, Guantanamo Bay. He and Dick Cheney were ruthless. It was not pretty. It was mostly, after 9/11 that things really started to go downhill, which ironically was when he had his highest approval rating and when he thought he had the most political capital. But yeah, he betrayed the trust of the American people. The Iraq War was not based on solid grounds, to say the least. And yeah, it was not a good look at all. He violated the Constitution a lot. But in terms of his rhetoric, I mean, he was not as fired up as Donald Trump. Joe Biden even has some authoritarian tendencies, I would argue. One of them being censoring speech online that is critical of COVID precautions and vaccines. I should say he was telling social media companies that they should censor that kind of speech. And yeah, that's not good. Even if it's misinformation, you don't get to just tell social media companies to censor it. The White House does not get to do that. But, the U.S. Supreme Court, with its 6-3 conservative majority, still sided with the Biden administration, funny enough, when they were sued for that. They dismissed for lack of standing. So then we get to Trump. He had his first term, which to some people seems uneventful, especially compared to the start of this current term. But even though I would normally agree, we can't ignore January 6th. We can't ignore the election denialism. We can't ignore, even as a candidate, he was saying the 2016 election was rigged, these polls are rigged, and really casting doubt on whether or not he would concede to Hillary Clinton if he had lost to her. Now, Hillary Clinton did concede. We don't know if Trump would because he won anyhow, only by the Electoral College. But yeah, he gets in there and he seems like kind of a normal Republican president for the most part, even though he was acting crazy on Twitter. But then the 2020 election rolls around and he starts casting doubt, saying don't use mail-in ballots. He challenges the election. He tries to overturn the results of the 2020 election. And he really fires up his cult, tells them that there was fraud. And so we have this whole swath of the American electorate that does not believe that Donald Trump was the loser of the 2020 election and believes Joe Biden was an illegitimate president just because their cult leader said so. That's concerning. And his ability to command a cult and tell them, you must think this, speaks to his authoritarianism. In 2024, again, he was saying there's probably going to be fraud. Democrats are probably going to cheat. He ended up winning, although there might have been some voter suppression that tilted the scales in his favor. But yeah, he won, and so he got to act all peachy keen and, happy and nice for once. And now he's come into the White House, and, he's kind of just, he's violating the Constitution brazenly multiple times, saying, I can fire this person, when it's really not clear at all that he can fire this person. The law does not provide that he can. He fired inspectors general on dubious grounds. He's got Elon Musk in the Treasury, an unelected guy an unelected billionaire, the richest person on the planet, who helped his campaign. Talk about corruption. And yeah, now he's quoting Napoleon Bonaparte. He's talked about, wanting to be a dictator on day one. He's referred to rhino Republicans as human scum. So he's saying it's not enough that you're just a Republican like me. You need to be a MAGA Republican, otherwise you're human scum. He really doesn't think highly of a lot of the population. He says, fall in line no matter what. So there's that. I mean, the free speech thing too. Like, you do have a right to sue people, but for crying out loud, this guy is so trigger happy with it. He is suing the media whenever they say anything like dubious about him whatsoever. And it's like, you're a public figure, dude. There's a higher standard. You have a heightened standard to meet for defamation, slander, libel, all that stuff. You need to prove actual malice. And yet you're so trigger happy with these lawsuits. And it's pretty embarrassing that ABC, cucks to him, so to speak, that they ran away with their tail between their legs and settled with him, because I think they could have won that case. I think they could have won, but they might have been afraid of something else from Trump, some other sort of revenge. And it's that revenge thing that's just so concerning, I think, that puts Trump over the edge in terms of his authoritarianism when you take into account both rhetoric and policy, that he's so focused on revenge. His posts on X are all about that. When there's a holiday, it's like, oh, happy holiday to the haters and losers. It's so spiteful. Suing people, yeah, all this lawfare, this nonsense. And then we also have to talk about the religious aspect, which came up recently, relatively, after this assassination attempt. It's one thing to say that, Democrats and you think their rhetoric might have caused that assassination attempt, which, by the way, there's no evidence of. But to say that God saved you, well, how convenient. Can we all just say that? Every person who drives a car on the road, we drive safely. We don't get into a car crash and die. Can we just say, oh, well, God saved me. God has a special plan for me. I'm supposed to lead this country because God has saved me. Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's totally absurd that a U.S. president would feel comfortable saying that, and that there aren't many people calling him out on it, and that, in fact, there are many members of his own party who are backing him on that, who are like, yeah, God sent President Trump. People in the media, people in the political commentary sphere. I mean, a lot of them would say it anyhow because they're super right-wing. But yeah, not a good look at all. And even though a lot of U.S. presidents have invoked religion before, none of them have done so in quite as authoritarian of a way as Donald Trump, I would say. And they've done it in some questionable ways. William McKinley used religion as his excuse for one of the Spanish-American War, I believe. George W. Bush, I think, even cited religion in the Iraq War and as part of his decision. So, I mean, religion has an ugly history of being cited for some of the worst possible things. And Trump is essentially trying to use religion to say he's the chosen one and that he has a right to be dictator because, God saved him. Like, in his view, is there anything that God would not want him to do? Is there anything about him that would not be backed by God? I don't know. I think he believes he has a right to do whatever he wants, and he just thinks that pesky Constitution is getting in his way. That's what's going on when you get down to it. And fortunately for him, he's got the U.S. Supreme Court to help interpret the Constitution in his favor. Remember, they held that basically as long as a president can spin something as being an official act of their presidency, they get to do it. They get immunity for it. You cannot prosecute them for it if they can make a trifle argument that, oh, it's part of my official duties as president. And I have very little doubt that the U.S. Supreme Court was not motivated by the fact that Donald Trump is a Republican and there are a bunch of right-wing justices. 6 of them were appointed by Republicans. Those 6 also happen to be conservative. We're done with the days where presidents could be appointed by one party but then actually rule the other way. Like Byron White was appointed by JFK, a Democrat, but he was more conservative. And John Paul Stevens was appointed by Republican Richard Nixon, but he was more liberal. The justices appointed by Republicans are super right-wing and will let the Republican presidents get away with a whole lot. And that Supreme Court ruling back in July, Trump versus U.S., that was a big freaking deal. So yeah, he's talked about using the military on the enemy from within. Again, just huge red flags for authoritarianism. And then he said, yeah, far left radicals, far left lunatics. Like, okay, really? are there not far-right lunatics that you could say the same thing about? Like what what about those guys who marched in Charlottesville and someone even got killed, Heather Heyer, in a truck attack at Charlottesville? What about using the American military on those enemies from within? Those are Nazis, neo-Nazis. America fought against the Nazis in the 1940s. There was a whole war, a world war against them. So, funny, you're not calling them the enemy from within. You just think anyone who aligns with the Democratic Party is the enemy from within. Back during his first term, he retweeted a video of a guy saying the only good Democrat is a dead Democrat. Again, where is there precedent for a U.S. president sharing something like this, sharing this type of sentiment towards their political opponents? At the end of the day, there is none. And there have been some aggressive U.S. presidents when it comes to calling out their opponents. None of them have scratched the surface of Trump. Harry Truman, a Democrat actually, was very aggressive against the Republicans, calling them like the do-nothing Congress and stuff. But yeah, no U.S. president really compares to Trump in terms of how much they demonize their political opponents. Trump also, I mean, if you want to argue, oh, he's anti-war, so that makes him non-authoritarian, I'm sorry to say, but he increased drone strikes 432%. He also, he's dropped massive bombs. He dropped a massive bomb on Afghanistan. He launched missiles at Syria. He has talked about going to war with Mexico over the cartels. And you can say, oh well, I think that's a just war. Doesn't change the fact that it is a war. And if you purport to be anti-war as a matter of principle, you should be against that type of thing. So yeah, he's authoritarian on foreign policy. There are some areas, like criminal justice, where it's like, okay, he signed the First Step Act. That's another area of policy where it's like, okay, Bill Clinton signed the crime bill, which led to a lot of massive incarceration. Richard Nixon was instrumental in starting the drug war. He went ham on it. He said it's time to tackle the drugs. Ronald Reagan amped it up quite a bit. So you could say that those presidents are more authoritarian on the issue of criminal justice than President Trump is. But I think when you take into account President Trump's rhetoric, it just pushes him over the edge. When it comes to policy, though, as I said, I think it's more of a wash. Trump's first term was rather uneventful during the first couple of years. I would admit that. I mean, it was not good. It was standard Republican, like help out the rich, which in its own way can be considered authoritarian because it's like, hey, guys at the top, guys who donate to my campaign, since you're so wealthy and you're so generous toward me, I'm going to cut your taxes. I'm going to make you pay less to the federal government. Essentially, a giant giveaway because you support me. So that, you could argue, is authoritarian, but it doesn't make him, I think, more authoritarian than other Republican presidents on policy. And I mean, let's just face it, we've had US presidents who had some really trying times, and as a result of those trying times, they enacted some policies that would be considered authoritarian and probably more authoritarian than the policies enacted by Donald Trump. You could argue in the defense of those US presidents that the time period they were in demanded that, but I don't think so. I don't think the time period of World War II demanded the internment of Japanese citizens, or World War I demanded the censorship of anti-war speech, anti-draft speech under Woodrow Wilson, or even Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, and there have been a lot of questions about that, and Abraham Lincoln is looked up to as a great president. But these presidents all had very trying times in front of them. And Trump, he kind of did with COVID. But, the election, that was where the main authoritarianism came from. And a lot of that was his rhetoric, not necessarily his policy. Like, he's not signing a bill that says Donald Trump is the winner of the 2020 election, even if he loses, even if he gets fewer electoral votes than Joe Biden. He just uses rhetoric to cast doubt on it. And he did challenge the election in court, which he does have the right to. He does have the right to do that. But then trying to stay in office and getting this mob of his supporters who ended up chanting to hang his own vice president, Mike Pence, that's authoritarian. That just is. Joking about being dictator on day one, if we can put that charitably. Again, The rhetoric just pushes him over the top. You know, at worst, he was straight up saying, yeah, I'm going to be a dictator. You know, like, screw it, day one, you know, whatever. Like, I'm going to be really aggressive on day one. But he's continued to be aggressive throughout his presidency. He's continued to make radical changes. He's continued to fire a bunch of these federal workers, just ruining these lives, saying, get out of here, federal government bad. And he's going to replace some of them with loyalists. We have to talk too about, the loyalist issue, that he demands absolute loyalty in his administration. And that's kind of a mix of policy and rhetoric, you know, because the fact that they're loyal to him might not inherently lead to authoritarian policy, but at the same time, it's authoritarian to demand absolute loyalty. It just kind of is. Adolf Hitler did that too. Sorry to bring up the Hitler comparison, but you can't help but notice some of these things. So, yeah. What other U.S. president has been so aggressive in demanding loyalty? I just don't know who comes close to President Trump in this regard. So that's my assessment. If you take into account both policy and rhetoric, it's not clear who the most authoritarian U.S. president is. Or excuse me, if you take into account only policy and not rhetoric, it's not clear. But if you take into account policy and rhetoric, Trump is the most authoritarian U.S. president. He just is. His rhetoric pushes him far over the top of anyone else. And you know what? You might think that's cool. You might think that he's a populist who's breaking the mold and, you know, just opening the door for some good old-fashioned fun and, you know, the president to puff their chest a little bit and we need a strong man. But just admit then that you like authoritarianism. Sorry. That's my assessment. Let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, please like, comment, or subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching. This has been the Morris the Merrier, and I look forward to speaking to you in my next video.